Hi, I'm Paul Nabil, Syrian American, and this is Start Here, Syria, Part 2, an overview of the factions that emerged in the early years of the Syrian Revolution. When we talk about Palestine, everybody says it's complicated when really it's pretty straightforward. Genocide, apartheid, ethnic cleansing are all pretty clear-cut bad things, and no amount of propaganda or whataboutism is ever going to change that. On the other hand, a lot of people say Syria is simpler than it really is. In Palestine, there is no war. It's just a genocide from a settler colonial nuclear power against native people with no formal military, just acts of resistance through organized militias. But in Syria, despite the existence of various demographics or foreign proxies or whatever, generally speaking, all of the fighting in Syria is between Syrians, whether or not it includes the government army or organized militias. By a conservative count, more than 120 militias organized throughout the course of the Syrian Revolution. That's nearly 14 years of coalitions that formed and fractured and reformed and reasserted their alliances one way or the other over and over and over again. If it was even possible to organize the revolution into two separate, distinct parties, it would be the regime on one side, that's Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian Army, and other official military wings, Russia, Iran, and by extension, Hezbollah, all on one side. And the other side would be everyone else who, in one way or another, is opposed to the Assad regime and its allies. But within that group opposed to Assad were several smaller subgroups of various factions, many of whom were also opposed to each other. And the dynamic nature of resistance and the rivalries and factions that emerged and coalesced and fractured is why the Syrian Revolution is so much more complicated. Including the Assad regime, I would identify 5 different umbrella groupings the various factions fall under. These are not hardline groupings. There's a lot of fuzziness, especially among the various rebel groups, but those are the Assad regime, Islamic State, other Salafist groups like Nusra and al-Sham, and later Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the moderate rebel groups, and finally the Kurds. And to explain the difference between these 5 groups, I am going to discuss them in terms of how they might try and recruit someone to their cause. The Assad regime says, "I'm secular and I protect minorities. I'm not a dictator, but if I sometimes act like one, it's because throughout history Arabs have proved they can't be trusted with democracy. My allies are more powerful than yours. Join us and fight the terrorists who are trying to tear Syria apart." The Islamic State, also called Daesh, ISIL, or ISIS, says, "Everyone is either a fake Muslim or non-believer. We are experienced militants who brought the West to its knees. We don't need foreign backers because we fund ourselves through conquered territory, smuggling, extortion, ransoms, and seized assets. Join us and help bring about a new worldwide Islamic caliphate implementing strictly enforced Sharia, or religious law." Other Salafi groups, like Al-Nusra Front, Ahrar al-Sham, and so on, say, "We are Sunni and will therefore protect Sunni Muslims, the majority sect in Syria. We are experienced and well-funded militants. Turkiye is a powerful ally in the north. Join us and we will create a Syria founded on tradition and Sharia, but not as extreme as the Islamic State." Moderate rebels, for example the Free Syrian Army, would say, "We are nationalists and our oppression must end. We are Sunni, but balance that with a vision of democracy that will not enforce Sharia. We're backed mostly by Turkiye now that the US switched to supporting the SDF. Join us and we will create a free and equal democratic Syria." And the Kurdish and Kurdish-led factions in Syria, that's PYD, YPG-YPJ, PKK, and the SDF. "We successfully implemented democratic confederalism after decades of experience with armed resistance and self-governance, aka autonomy. We are the only ones who will protect the Kurdish people specifically. We have a non-sectarian multi-ethnic recruitment policy. We use Syria's largest oil fields as bargaining chips to keep all other parties at bay. And we have the strongest possible ally, the United States. Join the most progressive group in Syria who will save you from both the regime and enforced Sharia. A lot of Syrians don't like referring to the revolution as a civil war or a proxy war. But I personally don't mind those terms as long as we identify the fact that they are in addition to the phrase Syrian revolution. The problem with calling it a civil war or proxy war is when it's done to invalidate the revolution itself. Because what many people say about Syria is that it began as a revolution but devolved into civil war or a proxy war. But it was a revolution the whole time. The Assad regime's propaganda very deliberately tried to turn it into some sort of framing where he was the anti-terrorist, non-sectarian option, the only stable option left after these factions emerged and started to butt heads with one another. Painting Syrian rebels as disorganized and ineffective was a big part of the Assad as anti-terrorist narrative. But the reality is, in modern times, all major wars are to some extent proxy wars, and all forms of large-scale resistance are going to be disorganized. They're going to involve themselves in some amount of war crime or atrocity, and that is why most stories of resistance at some point become stories of hopeful redemption. Trying to discuss the revolution in terms of these muddied waters takes us back to freezing up, doing nothing, thus supporting the status quo. And the status quo supports the existing power structure at the time, which in this case was a totalitarian dictatorial police state that regularly illegally imprisoned, tortured, and murdered its own people by the, we now know, tens of thousands. The Assad regime has perpetrated more war crime, more atrocity, more massacre upon its own people than any of the other factions, which means at some point, one of the rebel factions will have to emerge to replace the Assad regime. And so the purpose of this series is to give people the information they need to understand the various factions, understand the crimes of the Assad regime, and then use that information to make their own informed choices about the current situation in Syria and the recently disbanded group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. We discussed the crimes of the Assad regime leading up to the revolution in part 1 of this series. Iran had already been strongly tied to Bashar, as had Hezbollah. If you'll remember, the assassination of Lebanese Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri in 2005 had been carried out by Hezbollah at the behest of Bashar, and Hezbollah is Iran's proxy militia in southern Lebanon. Both Iran and Hezbollah are Shia Muslim, while the Islamist opposition factions are mostly Sunni. Bashar's family is from a small esoteric sect called Alawi, who are based largely out of Latakia in the northwest. It's important to know at least a bit of Iran's backstory. To make a very long story extremely short, Iran has oil. In 1953, Britain and America, through the MI6 and the CIA, collaborated in assisting the overthrow of the democratically elected Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh to empower the autocratic rule of the pro-Western Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. This was to prevent Mossadegh's nationalization of Iranian oil, which would have been disastrous for Western corporations. These Western clandestine operations included false flag attacks, paid protesters, targeted provocations, bribes and blackmail, and copious amounts of pro-coup propaganda. Though the Shah accomplished many modernizations and advanced the Iranian economy considerably, a lot of common Cold War issues arose as well, like failures of land redistribution and just a general lack of protections for the rural labor class. Severe antagonism came from the clergy elites who had lost a significant amount of income from land nationalization. Weaponizing modernization as the loss of traditional Islamic values, the clergy successfully ousted the Shah in 1979, resulting in the establishment of Khomeini as supreme leader of the new Islamic Republic of Iran, who positioned himself as an anti-Western savior. Today, Iran is still ruled by this authoritarian Islamist regime, which has spurred several revolts, most recently the women's uprising of 2022, after the murder of Jina Amini by Iranian police. But the Iranian regime has garnered an impressive military-industrial complex funded largely through its massive oil reserves, all of which allows it to stay in power, particularly through a robust trade relationship with Russia. Iran expands its influence by funneling a portion of these resources onto proxies throughout the region, which include Ansarullah, aka the Houthi rebels in Yemen, who are opposed to Saudi Arabia, who is a strong Western ally. Hamas and a few other Palestinian resistance groups who are opposed to the Western-backed Zionist occupation in the Levant. Various armed militias in Iraq, particularly following the disastrous U.S. invasion of 2003, and Hezbollah, the Shia militia formed in the 1980s to fight the Zionist occupation in southern Lebanon, who have since become both a powerful paramilitary group and political wing in Lebanon. Syria geographically connects these militias to Iran by way of Iraq. The symbiotic trade relationship between Iran and Russia is facilitated in large part by the Caspian Sea. But Syria has something neither of them can claim: direct access to the Mediterranean, not through the Black Sea or Crimea in Ukraine, but direct coastline, upon which are not one but two Russian military bases in Tartus and Latakia. Through this network, Iran, Syria, and Russia form a tripartite alliance of mutually beneficial and highly lucrative trade corridors that are operating outside of, and indeed directly opposed to, Western economic influence. It was because of this loose coalition that, when the revolution broke out in Syria, Bashar turned to Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia for help in quelling the uprising. Iran's army, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, already had a regular presence in Syria. Amidst the Arab Spring in 2011, Iran sent even more troops to fight for the regime. By 2012, thousands of Hezbollah fighters were in Syria, and Russian involvement began in earnest in 2015, with both ground troops and a devastating air campaign.
هذا إجرام النظام الروسي الصهيو إيراني.
In that same year, an official coalition was announced between Russia, Syria, Iran, and Iraq called the RSII, or sometimes the 4+1, with the +1 referring to Hezbollah. As a brief aside, back in 2002, the US President George W. Bush referred to Iran, Iraq, and North Korea as an axis of evil, using his standard post-9/11 war on terror rhetoric that painted the world in a binary of good and bad, or you're either with us or against us.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world by seeking weapons of mass destruction.
In response to these remarks, the Libyan newspaper Al-Zaf al-Akhtar retorted that it was more of an axis of resistance united by rejecting Western hegemony. Within a few years, Iran had adopted the us versus them phrasing for its own propaganda, a way to continue to frame the expansion of its influence as a noble and legitimate struggle against the heretical West. In particular, as has long been the case in Middle Eastern politics, Iran used this concept to posture themselves as the only viable network of militarized entities in the region that could present any meaningful challenge to the sole Western client state in the region, namely the Zionist apartheid occupation of Palestine, sometimes called Israel. It's a marketing tool used to paint this alliance of convenience as a more powerful, unified, strategic resistance coalition, which it very much is not. In the words of Lina Khatib, writing for Al-Majalla in September 2024, Iran's self-branding as the axis of resistance allows it to extend its influence in the region under the guise of liberating Palestine and confronting American aggression. Throughout the 20 years of the term's existence, it has been useful for invoking Iran's network of proxies in the Middle East. But the term masks the realities of Iran's and its proxies' objectives and relationships. The current Gaza conflict has underlined that the axis of resistance is a myth that never existed. In May of 2011, 2 months after the Syrian uprising broke out in earnest in Dara'a, Assad released more prisoners, as usual in a mock show of good faith. Political theater for both the Syrians who believed whatever they saw in state media and for the international community at large. But this specific prisoner release had a more insidious nature. As discussed in the previous episode, Regime propaganda painted the growing uprisings as the result of outside infiltrators. These included fighters or spies from the IDF or Mossad, Palestinians, Iraqis, Egyptians, or the Muslim Brotherhood. But these empty threats and accusations weren't having the desired effect to curb Syrian demonstrators in the context of the Arab Spring. So, the Assad regime decided to fulfill its own prophecy. In that first summer of the Syrian Revolution, Bashar purposefully released extremist militants from his own dungeons. The National featured an interview with a 12-year veteran of Syria's military intelligence directorate, an Alawi who defected from his unit in northern Syria in summer of 2011. The regime did not just open the door to the prisons and let these extremists out. It facilitated them in their work, in their creation of armed brigades. This is not something I heard rumors about. I actually heard the order. I have seen it happening. These orders came down from military intelligence headquarters in Damascus. The officer added that the regime made an abundance of weapons available to these actors in Idlib and also in Dara'a, where the uprising began. A handful of the prominent figures he released went on to establish or lead several of the warring factions that quickly infiltrated rebel groups across Syria through their experience, training, and connection to resources. This allowed Bashar to assert that he had been telling the truth when he called himself an anti-terrorist bulwark, when in fact he had been the one to release the extremists in the first place. As stated in a 2015 report, ISIS Inside the Army of Terror, quoted here by David Keane in Syria Playing into Their Hands, it was applied selectively. Plenty of protesters and activists were kept in jail, while an untold number of Salafist jihadists were left out. Of these, many had not long ago been on rat lines to join the insurgency in Iraq, only to return to Syria and be collared and locked up by the very mukhabarat that had sent them there in the first place. Among those who took up arms were Zahran Aloush, Hassan Aboud, and Ahmed Isla Sheikh, the current or former Salafist leaders of the best organized rebel brigades in Syria. There's a famous photograph of them standing in a row, all smiles, not long after being decreed free men by al-Assad. Future ISIS members were also amnestied, including Awad al-Makhlaf, who is now a local emir in Raqqa, and Abu al-Ahir al-Absi, who served time in Sednaya prison in 2007 for membership in al-Qaeda, and seems subsequently to have become ISIS provincial leader for Homs. Tariq al-Gharani, a Syrian who was imprisoned from 2006 to 2011 for subversive blogging, was later interviewed in Tunis. From the first days of the revolution, Assad denounced the organization as being the work of radical Salafists. So he released the Salafists he had created in his prisons to justify the claim. If you do not have an enemy, you create an enemy. But it didn't just stop at releasing them from his prisons. Throughout the revolution and civil war that followed, Assad's regime repeatedly supported the Islamic State in Syria through either passive or active means. When the Islamic State took over oil fields, the regime wasted no time in establishing trade connections, buying oil from ISIS in the northeast, and allowing them to collect taxes on those sales. They also purchased standard goods like wheat, making the Islamic State a small fortune at their height in Syria, to the equivalent of several million US dollars per week. The factions of Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, aka ISIS or ISIL, hinge on an ideology of beheadings, attacks against civilians, and heavily enforced Sharia law, ostensibly under the call to create a worldwide pseudo-caliphate modeled after a return to tradition inspired by antiquated medieval conservative nostalgia. They eschew collaboration with most other Islamic groups and especially detest moderate and or non-sectarian nationalist opposition. They heavily enforce the subjugation of women and tend to encourage externalist policies, i.e. engaging in both attacks and recruitment in foreign non-Arab majority countries. The Islamic State was the most extreme of the bunch. Other released prisoners formed their own Salafist groups like Ahrar al-Sham, formed in December 2011, which quickly became one of the largest rebel groups in northern Syria. Suqur al-Sham, founded in Idlib in September 2011, also emerged as a significant Islamist force before later merging with Ahrar al-Sham. They positioned themselves as Syrian-focused and generally maintained better relations with local communities than ISIS. These groups would not be considered moderate like the FSA, but while Salafi in nature, they were more focused on fighting the Assad regime rather than establishing a global caliphate. Also, unlike ISIS, they were generally more willing to collaborate with both Islamist and moderate factions. Al-Nusra Front, Islamic State, and Al-Qaeda were all interconnected but distinct Salafi factions. Al-Qaeda was the original overarching organization founded in Pakistan in 1988. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was founded in 2004 under Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, which eventually became Islamic State of Iraq under Abu Omar al-Baghdadi in 2006. At that same time, a different al-Baghdadi, Abu Bakr, first met a young extremist named Ahmed al-Shara, aka Abu Muhammad al-Julani, while they were both imprisoned in the notorious Camp Buqa, a US-run facility near Qasr, Iraq, which famously doubled as a training facility for Islamic extremists. Shara had impressed Baghdadi and other ISIS leaders with a 50-page academic paper he had written, the central thesis of which was that the failure of the uprising in Iraq was sectarianism, which might be avoided in the formation of a new faction in Syria.
أول شيء أنا طلبت 100 رجل أن يأتي معي، لكن كان هناك كثير من القيادات غير مرحب بالفكرة أنه أنا نذهب إلى سوريا يعني. فما أتى معي إلا تقريبا 6 أشخاص، فأتيت ب6 أشخاص فقط يعني.
Julani and his men, all wearing suicide belts in case they were caught, crossed into Syria a few months later.
أما المال يعني هو تقريبا يقدر تقريبا 50-60 ألف دولار في الشهر يعني لفترة وجيزة يعني 6 أشهر أو 7 أشهر يعني.
Once reaching Syria, Shara initially hid his association with Al-Qaeda, focusing instead on ingratiating himself with local communities, using the money to provide basic necessities like food, water, and medical care. The group he formed became known as Jabhat al-Nusra, the Front of the Supporters of the People of Syria, or just the People's Front. Their resistance tactics were also noticeably different compared to the Islamic State. Instead of beheadings and bombing civilian centers, Nusra used more standard insurgent practices like booby traps and suicide trucks targeting government buildings. Still, there were plenty of bystander casualties. They heavily enforced Sharia law in territories they controlled, although there was little, if any, forced conversion. They were also more experienced insurgents, better funded than the Free Syrian Army, and continued to provide basic services for territories that fell under their control. By summer of 2012, Al-Nusra Front boasted around 5,000 members and had developed a strong backing not just from Iraq, but Turkiye as well. In 2021, PBS Frontline did a special report centering around Shara called The Jihadist. According to their interview with Rania Abu Zaid,
this is very different from Islamic State of Iraq, which used to send suicide car bombs into markets and kill Muslims as indiscriminately as it killed anybody else. So it was
freelancer Rania Abu Zaid reported from Idlib with rebel forces in those early years.
So they weren't trying to impose their views on others, unlike, say, for example, some other conservative Salafi groups. Nusra was so popular, in fact, that when the United States designated it a terrorist organization, Syrians in the political opposition all rallied around it. And the next Friday, during protests, the chants were, "We are all Jabhat al-Nusra."
James Jeffrey, the U.S. ambassador to Iraq from 2010 to 2012, described Shara like this.
Look, he's the least bad option of the various options on Idlib, which is one of the most important places in Syria, which is one of the most important places right now in the Middle East. When there is not the normal setup of nation states and of international norms and rules, you wind up with groups like this that do things you don't like, but in the here and now are the folks you have to deal with to avoid even worse things.
As Shara himself put it,
نحن نتكلم عن منطقة يحكمها طغاة يحكمون الناس بالحديد والنار وفي نفس الوقت يحيط بهذه المنطقة صراعات وحروب كثيرة جدا. هناك آلاف الناس انتموا إلى تنظيم القاعدة. لكن دعنا نسأل ما هو السبب لانتماء هؤلاء الناس لتنظيم القاعدة؟ وهذا السؤال.
I really want to echo that. Why did they join Al-Qaeda? That's the question. Like Jeffrey said, you don't have to like it, but you have to ask yourself the very straightforward, very simple, very humanizing question of just why? Why join? Beyond nonsensical, thought-terminating cliches like, well, they just hate our freedom, or outright racism, the answer itself is also not that complicated. As in all forms of grassroots resistance, the answer is desperation. Because desperate people do desperate things. That doesn't excuse their actions, but it explains their actions in a way that humanizes them, that shows you that they felt they had no choice. Confronted with an impossible decision, Syrians were forced to do the calculus and choose what they at the time considered to be the least bad option. Case in point, Al-Nusra's association with Al-Qaeda was detrimental to recruitment. It was not a boon. Syrians needed things like food and water and electricity, and a lot of them wanted to take up arms to help fight the regime. But the extremist messaging was not popular among most Syrians. This was exacerbated when, in April 2013, Baghdadi publicly announced the merger of Islamic State of Iraq and Nusra Front under the new name Islamic State of Iraq and Al-Sham, or ISIS. But Dara'a and some al-Qaeda leaders rejected the merger, which led to a formal, violent split. Al-Nusra remained affiliated to al-Qaeda, while ISIS declared a caliphate in 2014. The two groups became immediate rivals in Syria. The Free Syrian Army was started by Riyad al-Assad, who is from Dara'a and, despite the similar last name, not directly related to the Assad family. He and several other Syrian Arab Army officers defected on July 29, 2011, and announced the formation of the Free Syrian Army to protect Syrian demonstrators from regime crackdowns and, ultimately, bring about an end to the Assad dynasty. Their mission was to replace it with a non-sectarian, free, national, democratic civilian government in Syria. At first, the FSA was run like a formal army, with a central command of a few dozen defected officers. Estimates vary, but by the end of 2011, it boasted somewhere between 15,000 and 25,000 members. It conducted raids against strategic regime locations in Damascus, Homs, Idlib, and Dara'a, as well as against army convoys and checkpoints largely along the western half of Syria, where the majority of the population resides. By November of that year, it had adopted the 1930 flag of the First Syrian Republic, a nationalist symbol from the struggle against the post-World War I French Mandate. On January 6, 2012, the high-ranking officer General Mustafa al-Sheikh of the Syrian Army defected from government forces to join the FSA. The following day, Colonel Afif Mahmoud Suleima of the Syrian Air Force Logistics Division defected as well, taking at least 50 soldiers with him.
We are from the army, and we have defected because the government is killing civilian protesters. The Syrian army attacked Hama with heavy weapons, air raids, and heavy fire from tanks.
Suleiman says Arab League monitors need to go to areas where there have been recent air raids. He wants them to see the damage for themselves and to uncover the graves in Hama that he says hold at least 460 bodies.
Turkiye played a crucial role in supporting the Syrian opposition. In October 2011, it began allowing the FSA to operate out of southern Turkey, to operate out of the southern Hatay province as a primary base. By mid-2012, Turkey was openly hosting FSA leadership and providing direct support through the establishment of refugee camps that doubled as rebel sanctuaries. By 2013, Turkey was a primary corridor for weapons and supplies to various rebel groups. But its involvement was complicated by multiple, often conflicting interests. 1. Supporting the overthrow of its longtime rival, the Assad regime. 2. Preventing Kurdish autonomous regions from forming along its border. 3. Maintaining influence over various opposition groups. This led to Turkey backing several rebel factions simultaneously, including some who were at odds with one another, which only added to the fracturing of opposition factions. The growing prominence of both ISIS and Kurdish forces in northern Syria further complicated these relationships. The original Free Syrian Army reached its height in mid-2012, successfully utilizing guerrilla tactics to push back regime forces and defend regions sympathetic to the opposition. They used light arms, AK-47s, improvised explosives, and some RPGs, along with a very small amount of heavy artillery, mostly captured from the regime. From the outset, they called for the international community to assist with ammunition and supply routes, but little was given. There had been hopes that Obama would be more enthusiastic to assist rebels opposed to Assad, but assistance was minimal and arrived too late. Obama, who was famously inept regarding complex geopolitics, was mostly anxious about the optics of publicly supporting another ground war in the region after the disaster of his predecessor's so-called war on terror. Throughout both of his terms, Obama instead preferred to utilize hundreds of remote drone strikes, mostly targeting Pakistan, Somalia, and Yemen. As such, it had been hoped that he might opt for at least some sort of air support against the Assad regime. There was a long, drawn-out discussion among the UN and Western powers to enforce a no-fly zone over Syria, which would have effectively ended the air superiority enjoyed by the Assad regime and, later, its strongest ally, Russia. None of this happened. Instead, the CIA under Obama initiated a clandestine project named Timber Sycamore that consisted of arming and training rebels without any more substantial military assistance. A U.S. tradition going back decades that rarely fares well for the rebels in question. The operation began in earnest in 2013, started to peter out by 2015, and ended completely in 2017, considered by all sides to have been an abysmal, costly, abject failure. The 2015 partial withdrawal was fueled by the fracturing of the Free Syrian Army due to lack of funding and supplies, leaving the U.S. to abandon it in favor of the Kurdish forces to the northeast. This is around the time the FSA is considered to have become fully decentralized, which we'll focus more on in a future episode about this fractious period. Today, some uninformed takes might derisively refer to the fall of the Assad regime as yet another Western-backed regime change. This is particularly insulting to Syrians whose memories aren't so short. In the modern era, when the US and/or NATO wants to actively topple a regime, it looks like a ground invasion in a no-fly zone, as was done in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. But, for better or for worse, the Free Syrian Army never received that kind of direct assistance from Western powers. After a few years of playing a game of chicken full of empty threats and imaginary red lines, Russia began its heavy air bombardment of Syria in 2015, with no repercussions from the international community, which turned the tide of war in favor of the Assad regime. Despite all this, the Free Syrian Army never went away entirely, and its flag became the enduring, non-sectarian symbol of revolution. It continued to stand in sharp contrast to Islamist flags, which tended to be some version of takbir or shahada on a stark black background. Variations of the Free Syria flag, as it came to be called, or even using its color scheme, tended to signal to Syrians that a particular faction was, 1. opposed to Assad, and 2. more moderate in nature, carrying on the dream of the original Free Syrian Army of a liberated and democratic Syria. Kurdish and Kurdish-led factions are going to need their own posts, which I'll do next, and then after that, we'll discuss the second half of the revolution and the factions that emerged then. Until then, I'm Paul Nabil, Syrian American, and this was Start Here, Syria. Thanks for watching.